In this episode, we are going to focus on a practical, often misunderstood problem: how regulatory compliance requirements get embedded into contracts and service agreements so the organization can meet its obligations even when work is performed by vendors, partners, or internal service providers. Beginners sometimes assume compliance is handled by policies and audits, while contracts are handled by procurement and legal. But contracts are where compliance becomes enforceable and where responsibilities become clear enough to hold up during incidents, audits, and disputes. When an organization uses third parties to store data, process transactions, provide managed services, or support critical operations, regulatory obligations often still apply to the organization, even if a vendor is involved. If a contract does not reflect those obligations, the organization may discover too late that it cannot get required evidence, cannot enforce required controls, or cannot meet required reporting timelines. Embedding requirements into agreements is therefore a form of risk management and governance, not a paperwork exercise. It turns external obligations into shared commitments with clear accountability and clear expectations. When you learn this skill, you learn how security leaders protect the organization from compliance gaps that are created not by technology, but by missing language and unclear responsibility. Before we continue, a quick note. This audio course is a companion to our course companion books. The first book is about the exam and provides detailed information on how to pass it best. The second book is a Kindle-only ebook that contains 1,000 flashcards that can be used on your mobile device or Kindle. Check them both out at cyberauthor.me in the Bare Metal Study Guide series. A strong place to start is understanding why contracts matter so much for compliance, because compliance obligations often require things that must be done by the provider. Many obligations require that certain protections exist, such as access control, logging, incident response capability, and data handling restrictions. Many obligations also require evidence, such as audit records, reports, and proof that controls are operating effectively. If a vendor provides a service that touches regulated data, the vendor may be the only party that can generate certain evidence or perform certain actions, such as notifying about incidents in the vendor environment. Without contract language, the organization may have no practical way to demand that evidence or action. Beginners sometimes assume that because the vendor promises security in marketing materials, the organization is protected, but marketing promises are not enforceable obligations. A contract defines what is required, when it is required, and what happens if it is not delivered. Contracts also clarify boundaries, which is vital because compliance often depends on the boundary between what the vendor does and what the customer does. If the boundary is unclear, controls fall into gaps. Embedding requirements, therefore, means making the boundary explicit and making compliance actions enforceable. To embed compliance requirements correctly, you need to understand what the obligations actually demand at a high level, because contracts should capture outcomes and responsibilities, not legal text copied without context. Many regulatory requirements can be translated into practical categories, such as confidentiality protection, integrity protection, availability expectations, access management discipline, incident reporting, and auditability. These categories then become contract commitments, such as requiring the vendor to implement controls, requiring the vendor to support customer oversight, and requiring the vendor to coordinate during incidents. Beginners sometimes think embedding compliance means listing a regulation name in a contract, but a regulation name does not tell the vendor what to do. A better approach is to translate obligations into specific requirements that can be verified. For example, instead of saying comply with applicable law, the agreement can specify that access to regulated data must be limited to authorized individuals, that access must be logged, that logs must be retained for a defined period, and that incidents affecting regulated data must be reported within a defined timeline. These are enforceable because they describe behavior and evidence. The contract becomes a bridge between regulation and operation. Scope is also essential because compliance requirements apply only where regulated data or regulated activities are involved, and contracts must define that scope explicitly. Scope includes what data types are covered, what systems are included, what services are provided, and what geographic or jurisdictional boundaries apply. If scope is unclear, the vendor may interpret obligations narrowly while the organization assumes broader coverage. That mismatch becomes a problem during audits and incidents when expectations differ. Beginners sometimes assume scope is obvious, but vendors often provide multiple services and may handle many customer environments differently. The contract should define which services process regulated data, what the vendor may do with the data, and whether subcontractors are involved. It should also define where data may be stored and processed, because location can drive legal obligations. Clear scope helps both parties understand what controls and evidence are required. It also reduces cost disputes because both sides know what is included. Embedding compliance requirements is therefore partly an exercise in careful boundary definition. Incident reporting and coordination requirements are among the most important contract elements for compliance because many obligations involve notifying regulators, customers, or oversight bodies within specific timeframes. If a vendor detects an incident involving regulated data, the organization may be required to act quickly, but it cannot act if it is not informed. Contracts should define notification timelines, the method of notification, and the minimum content of incident notifications, such as what happened, what data was affected, what actions are being taken, and what assistance the vendor will provide. Contracts should also define roles during incident response, such as who leads containment actions in the vendor environment and how decisions are approved. Beginners sometimes think incident clauses are mainly legal protection, but they are operational necessities because they affect response speed and accuracy. A good contract does not guarantee there will be no incident. It ensures the organization can respond effectively when one occurs. It also ensures that evidence is preserved and shared appropriately, because compliance and investigation often depend on logs and records. Clear incident clauses are one of the strongest defenses against chaos during a crisis. Auditability and evidence support are another major area, because compliance requires proof, not intent. Contracts should define what evidence the vendor will provide, how often, and in what format, such as regular reports, audit attestations, or access to relevant records. They should also define what audit rights the organization has, which may include the right to review vendor controls or to receive independent assessment results. Beginners sometimes assume the organization can always audit a vendor directly, but many vendors limit direct audits and instead provide standardized reports. The key is that the contract must guarantee access to whatever evidence is needed to satisfy the organization's obligations. If evidence requirements are not specified, the vendor may provide minimal information that is insufficient for audits. Contracts should also address retention of logs and records, because evidence may be needed long after an event. This is especially important for incident investigation and for demonstrating compliance over time. Auditability also supports accountability because it allows performance and control operation to be verified. Without evidence, oversight becomes trust-based, which is not adequate for regulated environments. Access control and personnel requirements are another area where compliance must be embedded because many regulations care about who can access sensitive information and under what conditions. Contracts should define how vendor personnel access is managed, how authorization is granted, and whether access is logged and reviewed. They may also include requirements for background checks, training, and role-based access control, depending on the sensitivity and obligations involved. Beginners sometimes assume vendors will handle these practices automatically, but vendor practices vary widely, and the organization's risk tolerance may be higher than the vendor's default. Contracts should also address subcontractors because subcontractors can create hidden access paths. If subcontractors are allowed, the contract should define whether subcontractors must meet the same requirements and how the vendor ensures they do. This is not about distrust. It is about ensuring the compliance chain remains intact. If a vendor uses subcontractors without adequate oversight, the organization may face compliance consequences even though the risk was introduced externally. Embedding personnel and access requirements helps prevent that gap. Data handling requirements often drive compliance, and embedding them into agreements requires clarity about data use, data sharing, retention, and disposal. The agreement should state what the vendor may do with the data, such as using it only to provide the service and not for unrelated purposes. It should define whether data can be transferred to other regions, whether it can be replicated, and what happens when the contract ends. It should also define how the vendor will securely delete data and how deletion can be verified, because retaining regulated data longer than necessary can create risk. Beginners sometimes overlook end-of-contract handling, but it is a common source of exposure because data can remain in backups or archives. The agreement should also define whether the organization can retrieve data in a usable format, which matters for continuity and for obligations like data access rights. Data handling clauses are the contract's translation of privacy and protection obligations into operational expectations. When these clauses are clear, they support both security and compliance while reducing misunderstandings. Finally, embedding compliance requirements into agreements must balance enforceability with practicality, because overly rigid requirements can increase cost and reduce the availability of suitable vendors. A mature approach prioritizes the requirements that are non-negotiable due to obligations and high-impact risk, and then negotiates flexibility where it does not undermine compliance. This is where risk-based thinking matters. Not every service needs the same level of requirements, and not every obligation applies equally to every data type. Security leaders work with legal and procurement partners to ensure requirements are expressed in a way that vendors can accept and implement. They also ensure that internal responsibilities are acknowledged, because shared responsibility means the organization may need to configure the service correctly and maintain its own processes. A contract cannot fix poor internal governance, but it can prevent the vendor relationship from becoming a compliance gap. Contracts should also include mechanisms for change, because obligations and services can evolve. When changes occur, the agreement should allow requirements to be revisited rather than becoming outdated. A living agreement supports a living compliance program. In conclusion, embedding regulatory compliance requirements into contracts and service agreements is about translating external obligations into enforceable commitments and clear accountability so the organization can meet its responsibilities even when services are provided by others. Contracts matter because they define what the provider must do, what evidence must be available, and how incidents are coordinated, and those elements often determine whether compliance can be demonstrated under pressure. Effective embedding begins with translating obligations into verifiable requirements and defining scope clearly so responsibilities and coverage are not misunderstood. Strong incident clauses, auditability commitments, access control expectations, and data handling rules protect the organization from late-stage surprises and chaotic response. Personnel and subcontractor requirements preserve the compliance chain, while practical negotiation ensures requirements remain achievable and cost-effective. When contracts reflect compliance needs accurately and are governed over time, they become operational controls that keep the organization's security and compliance posture coherent, defensible, and resilient across the full life cycle of vendor and service relationships.
Thanks for listening. For more audio courses, daily newsletters, and more, please visit baremetalcyber.com.